Continuing Chapter 10, The Secret of the Grail 1, The Mysteries, from Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. We know the entity best as Adonis, for it was under that name that, though not originally Greek, became known to the Greek world, was adopted by them with ardor, carried by them to Alexandria, where his feast assumed the character of a state solemnity. Under the name, his story has been enshrined in art, and as Adonis he is loved and lamented to this day. The Adonis ritual may be held to be the classic form of the cult. Now, as I've shown in some of my programs, Adonai is a rather varied term, leader of the community, but perhaps this is why Christianity appeared, is because some of the other Adonais, just like Baal, because that term was used. And really, it's less the Greek than the Judeo-Christian influence, right? But in Rome, the center of Western civilization, it was otherwise. There was the Phrygian entity who was in possession. The dominating position held by the cult of Attis and the Magna Mater, and the profound influence exercised by that cult over better known but subsequently introduced forms of worship have not so far been sufficiently realized. The first of the Oriental cults to gain a footing in the imperial city, the worship of the Magna Mater of Festinante, was for a time rigidly confined within the limits of her sanctuary. The orgiastic ritual of the priests of Cybele made at first little appeal to the more disciplined temperament of the Roman population. By degrees, however, it won its way, and by the reign of Claudius had become so popular that the emperor instituted public feasts in honor of Cybele and Attis, feasts which were celebrated at the spring equinox, March 15th to 27th. Well, around would be a better way to put it. As the public feast increased in popularity, so did the mystery feast, of which the initiated alone were privileged to partake, acquire a symbolic significance. The foods partaken of became a food of spiritual life, intended to sustain the initiate in the trials of existence. Philosophers boldly utilized the framework of the Attis cult as the vehicle for imparting their own doctrines. When Neoplatonism triumphs, the Phrygian fable will become the traditional mold into which subtle exegetes will boldly pour their philosophical speculations on the creative and fruitful principle of all material forms, and on the deliverance of the divine spirit which is submerged in the corruption of this terrestrial world. Well, it's not the matter, but the spirits that refuse to use the matter right, or have the right consciousness with that matter, isn't it? Certain of the Gnostic sects, both pre- and post-Christian, appear to have been enthusiastically participants in the Attis mysteries. Hepting, in his Attis study, goes so far as to refer to Bishop Aperkios, to whose enigmatic epitaph our attention was directed in the last chapter as the priest of Attis. Another element aided in the diffusion of the ritual. Of all the Oriental cults which journeyed westward under the aegis of Rome, none was so deeply rooted or so widely spread as the originally Persian cult of Mithra, the popular religion of the Roman legionary. But between the cults of Mithra and of Attis, there was a close and intimate alliance. In parts of Asia Minor, the Persian entity had taken over the features of the Phrygian entity. As soon as we can establish the presence of the Persian cult in Italy, we find it intimately united with that of the Great Mother Apessinonte. The union between Mithra and that which is considered to be a goddess by many, Anahita, was held to be the equivalent of the subsisting between the two great Phrygian entities, Attis, Cabela, the most ancient Mithraeum known. That at Ostia was attached to the Metroon, the temple of Cabela. At Salzburg, the ruins of the two temples are but a few steps apart. There is every reason to believe that the cult of the Iranian entity and that of the Phrygian entity considered to be a goddess existed in close communion throughout the whole extent of the empire. A proof is the close union of the two cults is afforded by the mystic rite of the Taurobolium, which was practiced by both, and which to the west at least seems to have passed from the temples of the Mithra to those of the Magna Mater. At the same time, Gaumont remarks that the actual rite seems to have been practiced in Asia from a great antiquity, before Mithraism had attributed to it a spiritual significance. It is thus possible that the rite had earlier formed a part of the Attis initiation and had been temporarily disused. Now, the Mithric cult concept, maybe not specific cults, but there's reason to think that such a worship of a Mithra entity as sort of an intercessor goes back maybe 18,000 years. 18,000 something, I don't remember. We shall see that the union of the Mithra-Attis cults becomes of a distinct importance when we examine the spiritual significance of these rituals and their elements of affinity with Christianity, their possible diffusion in the British Isles. But now, what do we know of the actual detail of the Attis mysteries? The first and most important point was a mystic meal, at which the food partaken of was served in the sacred vessels, the tympanum, and the symbols. The formula of an Attis initiate was, "I've eaten from the tympanum, I've drunk from the symbols." As I have remarked above, the food thus partaken of was a food of life. The devotees of Attis believed, in fact, that they were eating a magic food of life from the sacred vessels of their cult. Dieterich, I think that's the last name of the Joy of Satan Ministries leader, so that's obviously someone, probably a different family, probably, not directly descended, or perhaps they're rebelling against that heritage. Dieterich, in his interesting study entitled Ein Mithras Liturgy, refers to this meal as the center of the whole religious action.